He called himself BTK, 3 letters that would come to symbolize unspeakable terror: bind, torture, kill. To his neighbors in Wichita, Kansas, he was Dennis Rader, a church president, a city compliance officer, a family man. But behind that mask of normalcy lived a predator who stalked, planned, and struck with chilling precision. For nearly 2 decades, he played a sadistic game with both the police and the press, disappearing for years, only to resurface with taunting letters and cryptic clues. No one knew when he would strike again. In a city where families once left their doors unlocked, fear began to seep into every shadow. Anyone could be next. But what made BTK even more terrifying wasn't just his crimes. It was the horrifying truth of how close he lived to the very people he hunted. In the quiet suburbs of Wichita, Kansas, the Otero family lived a life that many would call ordinary. Yet it was the kind of ordinary that people often long for. Joseph and Julie Otero worked tirelessly to give their children stability, warmth, and a future filled with promise. Their modest home, nestled on a residential street, carried the familiar soundtrack of suburban America in the 1970s. The squeak of a screen door, the thud of school bags dropped on the floor, the laughter of children spilling into the yard. Joseph Otero, 38 years old, was a man of discipline, a retired Air Force sergeant. He carried himself with a mixture of authority and gentleness. He was the kind of father who believed in structure, but also in love. Those who knew him spoke of his unwavering devotion to his family. After serving his country, Joseph had traded the uncertainty of military life for the steady pursuit of civilian work. He wanted one thing above all: a safe environment where his wife and children could thrive. Julie Otero, 34, was the heart of the household. She balanced the demands of raising 5 children with the grace and resilience of a woman who found joy in the smallest details. Julie was described as soft-spoken yet firm, nurturing but never indulgent. Friends remembered her as someone who could light up a room with her presence, someone who made their modest home feel warm and inviting. She dreamed of seeing her children grow into successful adults, of family dinners that stretched late into the night, and of a life where love anchored every decision. Then there were the children, each at a different stage of life, each with their own path unfolding. Josephine, or Josie, was only 11 years old. At that age, the world still feels wide, magical, and brimming with possibility. She was bright, spirited, and curious, with the kind of innocence that radiates through everything a child touches. Josie loved animals, loved being near her mother, and carried the kind of light that makes parents believe in the beauty of the future. Joseph Jr., or Joey, was 9, energetic and playful. He was described as the typical young boy, fascinated by adventure, eager to explore his surroundings, and deeply bonded with his family. His world was school, friends, and the comfort of knowing his parents were always close by. The older siblings, Charlie, Danny, Carmen, were already carving their way into young adulthood, balancing the responsibilities of school with the natural pull of teenage independence. They were often out during the day, engaged in their own activities, while the younger ones remained at home under the watchful eyes of their parents. Together, the Oteros represented what many considered the American dream: a hard-working father, a caring mother, children with bright futures, and a household filled with both structure and love. Neighbors described them as approachable, dependable, and kind, the type of family that exchanged friendly waves across the driveway and joined in community gatherings. Nothing about them suggested tragedy. Nothing suggested that behind their front door, something unspeakable would unfold. And that's precisely what makes their story so chilling. Because in January 1974, that warmth, that safety, that fragile sense of suburban bliss was about to collide with something monstrous. The Oteros, in many ways, symbolized the very heart of innocence. They weren't reckless thrill-seekers, nor were they entangled in dangerous associations. They were ordinary, everyday people who happened to be in the wrong place, at the wrong time, when a predator decided to strike. And this is what makes their introduction to the story so important, because the horror that followed wasn't born from their choices, but from the intrusion of someone who lived by a code far darker than the world had ever imagined. On the morning of January 15, 1974, the Oteros carried on with their lives unaware of the shadow moving closer. To them, it was a day like any other. The children were preparing for school. Julie was guiding her morning routine, and Joseph was preparing to head out for work. The atmosphere inside their home was one of normalcy, of daily rituals that every family can recognize. The scramble to find school books, the chatter over breakfast, the last-minute reminders of "don't forget your coat." But outside their walls, another routine was unfolding. A man was watching, planning, calculating. He wasn't just seeking victims, he was seeking control. The kind of control that went beyond possession, beyond violence. His twisted desires demanded not just the act itself, but the orchestration of it, the ability to invade a sanctuary and bend it to his will. The Oteros didn't know it, but their home, their lives, had already been chosen. This is what chills us to the bone when we revisit their story, not simply the brutality of what happened, but the jarring contrast between their ordinary world and the predator who entered it. One moment they were a family planning for the future. The next they were unwittingly stepping into history, becoming the first names etched into the legend of a man who would soon be known as BTK. The Oteros remind us of something we often try to ignore, that evil doesn't always target the reckless, the careless, or the exposed. Sometimes it invades the lives of those who embody innocence itself. And as we step further into their story, the warmth of their household fades into the cold, unsettling truth. What was about to unfold would not only change the Otero family forever, but would mark the beginning of a nightmare that haunted an entire city for decades. The early 1970s, Wichita, Kansas, was the kind of city people described as safe, steady, and almost ordinary to the point of comfort. It sat in the middle of America's heartland, a place where the hum of aircraft factories and the sight of endless flat plains gave residents a sense of routine stability. Families built lives in neat neighborhoods with single-story homes, trimmed lawns, and driveways filled with Fords and Chevrolets. Children played outside until dark. Parents left their front doors unlocked, and neighbors knew each other by name. Wichita was not New York or Los Angeles, not a city that fed on chaos. It was the kind of place where the horrors you read about in the newspaper seemed distant, belonging to other worlds. Not here, but safety has a way of dulling vigilance. When a city believes itself untouchable, it rarely sees the shadows creeping in. In Wichita, that sense of trust became the perfect camouflage for someone who lived among them. Someone who looked like an ordinary man but carried thoughts that belonged to monsters. The city's quiet streets, its isolation, its routine, these were not barriers to evil. They were invitations. Before 1974, crime in Wichita rarely made national headlines. Petty theft, bar fights, maybe an occasional domestic dispute. These were the kinds of cases the police dealt with most often. Murders happened, but not frequently enough to feel like a threat to the city's identity. Wichita was a place where children still walked to school alone. Teenagers roamed the streets at night without fear, and church on Sunday was a cornerstone of community life. For many, the idea of a predator hunting families within their own homes was simply unthinkable. That kind of horror belonged to bigger cities, places far away. What made Wichita particularly vulnerable was its geography. The city was large enough to feel metropolitan, but spread out enough to create long stretches of isolation. Blocks that seemed busy in the daytime could feel deserted at night. Streetlights cast more shadows than they erased, and the silence after dark was so heavy that a muffled cry or a creaking floorboard could vanish into nothing. The neighborhoods, designed to offer comfort, instead created perfect hunting grounds for someone who wanted to stalk without being seen. Wichita's culture reinforced this illusion of safety. In the 1970s, America was shifting. Vietnam had ended. Watergate was unraveling faith in politics, and new cultural movements were reshaping cities along the coasts. But in the heartland, tradition still reigned. Family was everything. Church attendance was high. Neighbors trusted one another because that was what you did in places like Wichita. It was a community that believed in good intentions, where suspicion of your fellow man was seen as cynical or even rude. And that belief, that ordinary people could not be hiding extraordinary darkness, was precisely the belief Dennis Rader exploited. When the first killings occurred, the shock was not just in the brutality, but in the sheer impossibility of it. Families like the Oteros were not reckless or careless. They were the embodiment of suburban life, people who represented stability and innocence. The fact that they could be targeted shattered the city's sense of security. If something so horrifying could happen to them, then no one was safe. The transformation of Wichita was almost immediate. What had once been a city of open doors became a city of locks and alarms. Hardware stores ran out of padlocks. Security systems, previously a luxury, became a necessity. Parents stopped letting children walk to school alone. Strangers were no longer greeted with warmth, but studied with suspicion. People who once waved to every passerby now drew their curtains tight and kept the lights on at night. For the killer, this atmosphere of paranoia only added to the game. He had not just taken lives. He had taken the city's innocence. Wichita became a place where fear lingered in every shadow. People began to notice details they might once have ignored. The way a car seemed to idle too long on a street. The unfamiliar man who passed in the grocery aisle. The sound of footsteps echoing behind them at night. Ordinary life had been infected with suspicion. Even the city's silence worked against it. Wichita was not packed with noisy streets or crowded apartment complexes, where a scream might be heard by dozens. It was quiet, residential, private. In that environment, a predator could study routines, slip into homes, and vanish without a trace. And while the people of Wichita tried to move forward, to live as if nothing had changed, the truth was undeniable. The predator was still out there, unseen, and possibly closer than anyone wanted to believe. Years passed, and yet the fear never fully disappeared. Each new murder reignited the whispers. Was he back? Was he watching? Neighbors eyed each other with unspoken questions. Could the man mowing his lawn down the street be BTK? Could the man shaking your hand at church be the killer? Wichita was no longer just a city. It was a stage, and the entire community had become unwilling actors in his performance. The most unsettling part of this transformation was how ordinary the city still looked from the outside. The factories still thrummed with industry. Schools still held football games. Churches still rang their bells on Sundays. Life went on. But beneath the surface was a quiet dread that never fully lifted. Wichita had become infamous not for its aircraft or its resilience, but for the ghost that haunted it. BTK had turned the city itself into part of his legend. And that legend changed how Wichita saw itself forever. Once it was a place where neighbors left doors unlocked, where children wandered freely, and where fear felt like something that belonged to other places. But after BTK, it became a city that knew too well the darkness that can hide in plain sight. It learned the hardest lesson of all, that evil doesn't always come from strangers on the highway or drifters passing through. Sometimes it comes from the man who smiles at you across the street, the man who takes out his trash at the same time you do, the man you believe you know. The morning of January 15, 1974, began like any other in Wichita. The air was crisp, the streets alive with the sounds of a city waking up. But inside one home, the ordinary rhythms of breakfast and school preparation would be shattered by a presence that had been watching, planning, and waiting for weeks. Dennis Rader had chosen his first victims, and the Otero family's lives would become the opening act of a nightmare that would span decades. Rader had stalked them carefully. He knew Joseph and Julie Otero had children, knew their schedules, knew when the older kids would be gone, leaving only the younger ones at home. His fantasy demanded total control, and control required planning. That morning he slipped into their lives with a calmness that only made the brutality more chilling. By the time neighbors realized something was wrong, the Oteros were gone. Joseph and Julie, their 9-year-old son Joey, and their 11-year-old daughter Josie. The discovery of their bodies spread like wildfire. A family murdered in their own home was unthinkable in Wichita. Parents clutched their children tighter. Doors that once stayed unlocked were suddenly bolted. The city had changed overnight. The police scrambled, but nothing about the crime made sense. There was no robbery, no clear motive. The crime scene was meticulously staged, as if the killer wanted them to see his signature, but not his face. The brutality was shocking, yet it was the precision that unnerved investigators. Whoever had done this hadn't stumbled into the house by chance. He had orchestrated it, and as detectives combed through the evidence, one thought kept surfacing. This was only the beginning. Rader lay low after the Otero murders. For months, Wichita breathed cautiously, waiting for news of another attack. But nothing came, at least not immediately. The city tried to return to normal, but whispers of the Oteros never fully faded. Then in April of that same year, he struck again. Catherine Bright, a 21-year-old student, was attacked in her home after returning with her brother Kevin. Unlike the Otero murders, this time there was a survivor. Kevin fought hard and managed to escape, though seriously wounded. His survival gave police something they hadn't had before: a description of the killer. Tall man, average build, wearing a mask. It wasn't much, but it was something. Still, it wasn't enough to stop him. After Bright, Wichita descended into something more sinister than fear: uncertainty. Was this the same man who had killed the Oteros? Was there a pattern? Or was Wichita now cursed with more than one killer? Rader fed on this confusion. He was meticulous in watching the city's reaction, adjusting his methods, learning how much fear he could inject without exposing himself. For him, the murders were only part of the thrill. The aftermath, the headlines, the way the community whispered his name without even knowing who he was, that was the fuel he craved. Years passed, and the killings slowed. Wichita began to wonder if the predator had moved on, been arrested for something else, or perhaps even died. Life settled into a fragile rhythm again. Then, in March of 1977, that illusion was torn apart. Shirley Vian, a mother of 3, was discovered dead in her home. Her children, terrified and locked away in a bathroom, had heard everything. The horror of her murder was compounded by the chilling detail that the killer had let the children live. To investigators, it was as if he wanted them to bear witness, not just to the crime itself, but to the idea that Wichita's families were never truly safe. Just months later, in December 1977, another murder rattled the city. This time it was Nancy Fox, a 25-year-old secretary. Rader relished this crime more than the others, because it gave him the chance to deliver his message directly. After killing Nancy, he called the police himself, his voice calm, deliberate, almost taunting as he reported the crime. "You will find a homicide at 843 South Pershing," he said. The words chilled the dispatcher, and when officers arrived, they found Nancy's body exactly as described. Wichita now had confirmation that these killings were connected, and worse, that the killer wanted to be recognized. Then came the letters. The first one arrived at a local television station in 1978, claiming responsibility for the Otero murders and describing details only the killer could know. The writer signed the note with 3 letters: BTK, bind, torture, kill. The name was not given to him by the media or the police. He gave it to himself, branding his crimes with a moniker designed to terrify. Wichita was no longer haunted by a faceless killer. They now had a name, and that name would become infamous. The correspondence marked a turning point. This was not just about murder. This was about control, about forcing the city to acknowledge him. BTK sent poems, riddles, and cryptic messages to police and newspapers. He demanded attention, craved recognition, and seemed to delight in the city's fear. Investigators were trapped in a game with someone who always seemed 2 steps ahead. He would kill, then vanish for years, resurfacing only when he felt his name was fading from memory. Each time he returned, it was with a new letter, a new taunt, reminder that he was still there. In 1985, the city's nightmare returned when Maureen Hedge, a 53-year-old widow, was murdered in her home. The crime shook Wichita again because of how close Hedge lived to Rader himself, just down the street. The killer was hiding in plain sight, close enough to be a neighbor, a co-worker, or even a friend. That realization unsettled people more than anything else. He wasn't an outsider. He was one of them. The following year, in 1986, Vicky Vegerla, a 28-year-old mother, was murdered in her home. The crime initially baffled investigators, but photographs later surfaced proving it was BTK's work. This was his pattern. He not only killed, he documented, cataloged, and relived his crimes. His trophies weren't money or possessions. His trophies were control, evidence of his dominance, reminders that he could create nightmares whenever he chose. The final known victim was Dolores Davis in 1991. She was strangled in her home, her body left in a remote ditch. By then, the killings had spanned nearly 2 decades. Wichita had learned to live with the shadow of BTK, but the silence after Davis's murder brought a strange new chapter. For over a decade, there were no new crimes, no letters, no taunts. People began to hope he was gone for good. Some whispered he had died. Others believed he was in prison under another name. The absence of BTK was almost as chilling as his presence. What kind of killer could simply stop? But Rader hadn't stopped. He had simply gone dormant. During that time, he built his life as a husband, a father, a church leader, and a compliance officer for the city. To those around him, he was ordinary, respectable even. His neighbors trusted him. His co-workers respected him. His church saw him as a man of faith. All the while, the memories of his crimes, the photographs and the fantasies were hidden behind the mask of a suburban family man. Then, in 2004, a local newspaper ran an article marking the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders, speculating about what had become of BTK. For Rader, it was an insult. They had begun to forget him. His ego couldn't tolerate obscurity, and so he resurfaced. He sent a package containing photographs, a word puzzle, and a copy of Nancy Fox's driver's license. The city's old nightmare had returned. For the next year, he resumed his game of cat and mouse, sending packages and letters, each one laced with taunts and hidden clues. Investigators scrambled, desperate to catch him before he vanished again. Then, in one of the strangest twists of the case, BTK made a fatal mistake. In 2005, he sent a floppy disk to a local television station, asking police if it could be traced. Assured that it couldn't, he mailed it. Within days, forensic experts extracted metadata from the disk, linking it to a church computer and to a man named Dennis Rader. After more than 30 years of fear, the name behind the mask was finally revealed. The arrest shocked Wichita. Dennis Rader was not a drifter, not a shadowy figure on the margins of society. He was a husband, a father of 2, a respected member of his community. The very ordinariness of his life was what made him invisible for so long. He lived among the people he terrorized, sat beside them in church, enforced city codes on their property, waved to them from across the street, all while hiding the darkest of secrets. From the Oteros in 1974 to his final letter in 2005, the timeline of BTK's reign stretched over 3 decades. It was a story of control, of patience, of a man who built his crimes like performances and demanded an audience that could never look away. Each act of violence was followed by silence, each silence by a taunt, until the city itself felt like it was dancing to his twisted rhythm. For Wichita, time had been divided into 2 realities, life before BTK and life under his shadow. And even after his capture, the scars remained. The events etched into Wichita's history were not just about the murders themselves, but about the years of dread, the stolen sense of safety, and the chilling realization that the man next door could be the very monster you feared. The timeline was not just the record of one man's crimes. It was the story of an entire city, held hostage by fear, waiting for a knock at the door that might never come, or might come too late. January 15, 1974, began as an unremarkable winter day in Wichita. The Otero children left for school, but that afternoon when the older siblings returned home, what they walked into was something no one could have imagined. They opened the front door expecting the warmth of a family house. Instead, silence greeted them. Something felt wrong immediately. Shoes scattered where they didn't belong, an eerie stillness in the air. As they moved through the home, the nightmare unfolded. Their parents, Joseph and Julie, lay lifeless. Nearby, 9-year-old Joey and 11-year-old Josie were discovered, their young lives brutally cut short. The crime scene was unlike anything local law enforcement had seen before. There was no chaos, no frenzy, no sign of a rushed burglary gone wrong. Instead, it was methodical, staged, and chillingly deliberate. The bodies bore the signature of control and cruelty. Officers who had walked through dozens of crime scenes in their careers found themselves shaken in ways they couldn't explain. Wichita was not supposed to be the place where families died together in their own homes. But now it was, and the specter of what had been done inside that house would haunt the city for decades. Word of the murders spread almost instantly. Neighbors gathered outside the Otero home, their breath fogging in the cold air as whispers moved through the crowd. How could this happen here? Who would do such a thing? The idea that someone in their community had orchestrated the deaths of not just parents, but children, shattered their faith in safety. Police urged calm, but the undercurrent of fear was too strong. Wichita had changed in a single afternoon. For months, the city lived with that fear, waiting for answers that never seemed to come. Then in April, the killer struck again. Catherine Bright, a young woman with her life ahead of her, was attacked in her home. Her brother Kevin was with her that day, and his memory of the assault would become one of the few first-hand accounts of BTK's method. Kevin fought back, clawing against the attacker, enduring multiple stab wounds before somehow managing to escape. His survival was a miracle, but it came at a devastating cost. Catherine did not survive. When police arrived, they found her lifeless body and a scene that echoed the Oteros. Not identical, but disturbingly similar in the hallmarks of control and domination. Kevin's testimony was invaluable, but it was also vague. The attacker had worn a mask, and the encounter was so sudden, so violent, that Kevin could not provide a detailed description. Still, the fact that a witness had survived rattled the killer. He had lost the perfection of total control. But in his twisted way of thinking, it also gave him something new. The thrill of being discussed, imagined, speculated about. Wichita now knew they were dealing with a predator who wasn't done. After Bright's murder, the city braced for another attack. Weeks turned into months and months into years, and yet nothing happened. The silence was its own kind of torment. Had the killer left? Had he been caught elsewhere? Or was he simply watching, waiting for the right moment? For many families, the answer didn't matter. They bought new locks, installed lights, and taught their children to never open the door to strangers. Wichita was no longer a city of trust. It was a city of suspicion. 3 years later, in March of 1977, the silence was broken. Shirley Vian, a mother of 3, lived in a modest home where she did her best to juggle the chaos of raising children. On that day, the chaos was interrupted by terror. Her children were forced into a bathroom, locked away while their mother faced the intruder alone. They heard muffled cries, movements, and then silence. When the children finally emerged, what they found was too much for them to comprehend. Their mother was gone, taken from them in a way that left scars far deeper than the physical crime scene. When police arrived, they encountered not only the body of Shirley Vian, but the haunting reality of children traumatized by what they had been forced to endure. For the killer, sparing the children wasn't mercy. It was theater. He wanted survivors, witnesses to spread the fear, and it worked. 9 months later, in December, another call shook the city. This time it was Nancy Fox, a young secretary living alone. Her co-workers grew concerned when she didn't arrive for work, and soon police were dispatched to check on her. What they found was a scene that froze them in place. Nancy was dead, the marks of strangulation telling a silent story of control. But what made this crime different was what followed. Not long after the murder, the police received a phone call. A calm, deliberate voice reported the crime, giving the address with the detached tone of someone ordering a pizza. That voice belonged to BTK himself. He was no longer content with silence. He wanted recognition. He wanted them to know, and recognition came. In 1978, Wichita received the first of many letters. The Otero murders, Catherine Bright, Shirley Vian, Nancy Fox. The writer claimed them all. He described details that had never been made public, details that only the killer could know. At the bottom of the letter, he signed it. BTK, bind, torture, kill. It wasn't a name the police or the media had given him. It was the name he had chosen for himself, a brand, a chilling proclamation of his identity. With those 3 letters, Wichita's phantom had a face, if not an appearance. Then in legend, the letters came sporadically, each one taunting investigators, each one a cruel reminder that he was still out there. Sometimes they came with poems, sometimes with word puzzles, sometimes with cryptic references to past crimes. He reveled in the attention, in the fact that the city trembled at every envelope delivered to the newspaper or the police. For BTK, killing was only part of the performance. The discovery, the headlines, the fear, those were his encore. In April of 1985, Wichita's fragile peace was shattered again. This time the victim was Maureen Hedge, a widow who lived just down the street from Dennis Rader himself. That proximity would later horrify the community. To think that BTK had not only lived among them, but had chosen a neighbor was almost too much to comprehend. The crime was as brutal as the others, and the revelation that she lived so close to the man who would eventually be unmasked as BTK left many wondering just how many times they had passed him on the street, smiled politely, or exchanged words with a man who was secretly a predator. In September 1986, Vicky Vegerla, a young mother, was murdered in her home. At first, her death did not fit neatly into the BTK narrative. Investigators weren't sure if this was his work. It wasn't until years later, when photographs taken by the killer himself surfaced, that the connection was confirmed. The images showed not only the crime, but the pride he took in documenting it. Vicky's death, like the others, was less about impulse and more about control, about ownership. For BTK, the photographs were trophies, evidence of his power. By 1991, his crimes had stretched across nearly 2 decades. The final known victim was Dolores Davis, another woman who lived alone. Her body was discovered in a remote ditch after she was taken from her home. The brutality was the same, the control unmistakable. But after Davis, the murder stopped. At least that's what it seemed like. Wichita, exhausted and paranoid, began to wonder if BTK had finally vanished for good. The silence stretched for more than a decade. Families tried to heal, but the scars never truly faded. Wichita had become a city of routines warped by fear. Neighbors who once waved from their driveways now peered through curtains. Women double-checked their locks before bed. Men taught their children to be suspicious of strangers, of cars parked too long, of anything out of place. The crimes had ended, but the discovery of each body had permanently reshaped the city's psyche. Then, in 2004, 30 years after the Oteros, a newspaper article marking the anniversary reignited something in Dennis Rader. He could not stand the idea of being forgotten, and so he returned. Packages began appearing around Wichita, each one containing reminders of his past crimes, photographs, puzzles, even a victim's driver's license. The city's old terror returned overnight. After years of silence, BTK was back, and the discovery of his letters reminded Wichita that their nightmare had never truly ended. The final discovery came not at a crime scene, but in the digital traces of his own arrogance. In 2005, a floppy disk sent to a television station was examined by forensic experts. Within its metadata, they found the name of a church and a man, Dennis Rader. When investigators moved in, they uncovered a suburban family man, a church leader, a city compliance officer. For 3 decades, he had lived a double life, his crimes hidden behind the mask of ordinary respectability. The discovery of his identity was almost as shocking as the crimes themselves. Looking back, the discovery of each crime scene was more than just evidence of a murder. It was a rupture in the fabric of Wichita's belief in safety. The Otero home, where children were silenced alongside their parents. The Bright household, where a brother's survival told of the killer's methods. The Vian residence, where children cowered while their mother was taken from them. Nancy Fox's apartment, reported by the killer himself. Each discovery carried its own unique horror. But together they painted a portrait of control, of performance, of a predator who saw the city not as a place to live, but as a stage for his darkest fantasies. For the families, the discovery was devastation. For the police, it was frustration. For the city, it was trauma. And for BTK, it was triumph. Because in the end, the discovery of his crimes was not the end of his performance. It was the very point of it. He wanted to be seen, to be recognized, to be feared. Each body, each letter, each call was a way of ensuring that the city of Wichita would never forget his name. And they never have. From the moment the Otero family murders shattered Wichita, in January of 1974, the investigation took on a scale that the local police force had never experienced before. Detectives were called from across the city, evidence technicians combed through every inch of the home, and dozens of interviews began immediately. Wichita's homicide department was accustomed to crimes of passion, burglaries gone wrong, or domestic disputes that escalated into violence. But this was different. It wasn't just the brutality. It was the precision. The Otero home looked like a crime scene staged by someone who wanted it to be studied. Detectives found footprints, bindings, and signs of careful planning. But what they didn't find was perhaps more disturbing. There was no forced entry, no stolen valuables, no obvious motive. Whoever had done this had come into the Otero home with one purpose only: to kill. And not just to kill, but to dominate, to orchestrate every moment. Investigators began building profiles, sketching out theories, but each one fell apart as soon as it was tested against the evidence. Was this a stranger who picked the Oteros at random, or someone who had been watching them for weeks? The answers refused to come. When Catherine Bright was killed just a few months later, police recognized the signature instantly. The bindings, the calculated cruelty, the control. It was too similar to ignore. But this time there was a survivor. Kevin Bright's testimony should have broken the case open. He had fought the attacker, seen him up close, even heard his voice. Yet when asked to describe him, Kevin struggled. The trauma of the moment, combined with the mask and the blinding intensity of the attack, left his memory fractured. The description he gave, an average-looking man in his 20s, possibly with dark hair, could have matched thousands of men in Wichita. Detectives circulated composite sketches, but they led nowhere. As months stretched into years, the investigation became a haunting routine. Tips poured in, but most were useless. Every suspicious neighbor, every odd co-worker, every quiet man who lived alone became a potential suspect. Detectives interviewed hundreds, sometimes chasing a lead for weeks, only to hit another dead end. The frustration grew heavy. And yet they knew one thing for certain. The killer was still out there, and he would strike again. When Shirley Vian was murdered in 1977, the investigation took a darker turn. For the first time, surviving witnesses, the children, could describe some of what had happened. Their accounts, however, were confused, fragmented by fear. They remembered a man forcing them into the bathroom, tying the door shut, then going after their mother. They couldn't describe his face clearly, but they remembered his calmness, his authority. Detectives realized they weren't dealing with someone who lost control in a moment of rage. They were facing a planner, someone who rehearsed, someone who treated murder as ritual. The case broke wide open later that same year with the murder of Nancy Fox, because this time the killer himself had called the police. Investigators traced the call to a payphone, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. Still, they had his voice on tape, a calm, almost bored male voice reporting his crime. "You will find a homicide at," he said, giving the address with chilling detachment. Detectives replayed the tape endlessly, trying to match the voice to suspects they'd interviewed. But Wichita was a city of thousands, and the voice could have belonged to anyone. Then came the letter, typed, detailed, and signed with 3 letters: BTK, bind, torture, kill. It was the first time investigators had a name for their phantom, though it was one he had chosen for himself. The letter contained facts about the Otero murders that had never been released to the public, details only the killer could know. This was no hoax. It was him. Wichita now had its first confirmed communication with the predator who had been haunting the city for 3 years. The investigation shifted into overdrive. A task force was formed, drawing detectives from across the department. The FBI was brought in to consult on criminal profiling, a relatively new science at the time. Behavioral experts suggested that BTK was likely a white male, in his late 20s or early 30s, organized, methodical, and living a seemingly ordinary life. He was not the kind of man people would suspect. He blended in. He had a job, possibly a family. He lived quietly, invisibly, until the moment he struck. This profile was chilling, because it meant the killer could be anyone. The man mowing his lawn, the clerk at the store, the fellow churchgoer, all of them could be BTK. The letters continued. Sometimes they were sent to the police, other times to local newspapers or television stations. They were rambling, self-aggrandizing, filled with references to his projects and demands for attention. He compared himself to other infamous killers, demanded that the media give him a proper name, and threatened more deaths if he was ignored. For detectives, the letters were both a curse and a blessing. They confirmed that BTK was still active, still in Wichita, but they also revealed just how much he craved recognition. He wasn't killing only for himself. He was killing for the story, for the legacy. for the power of being feared. Investigators tried to use this against him. They studied the letters for forensic clues, fingerprints, fibers, DNA. But he was careful. He wore gloves. He used envelopes and paper that could be bought anywhere. He left nothing that could tie him back to a specific place or identity. The letters were filled with spelling errors, deliberate or not, making it difficult to judge his level of education. He seemed to enjoy this dance, the way the police scrambled with each new message. The task force ballooned to dozens of officers, all working long hours. Yet the case refused to break. Every promising lead collapsed under scrutiny. A suspicious man turned out to have an alibi. A strange vehicle spotted near a crime scene belonged to a delivery driver. At one point, police even arrested a man they believed could be BTK, only to find the evidence against him was circumstantial at best. He was eventually released, and the real killer watched with satisfaction as investigators wasted precious time. The psychological toll was enormous. Detectives carried the weight of failure with them everywhere. They knew the killer was reading the newspapers, watching the coverage, enjoying the fear he had created. Each new murder felt like a personal defeat. Families of the victims demanded answers. The media pushed for progress, and still, BTK remained just out of reach. In the 1980s, the investigation stretched into its second decade. New victims like Maureen Hedge, killed in 1985, and Vicky Vegala, murdered in 1986, were added to the list. Though in Vegala's case, it would take years before investigators confirmed it as BTK's work. Each new murder reignited the frenzy, but the same frustrations haunted the case. No witnesses, no clear evidence, no breakthroughs. The killer was a ghost who appeared only long enough to strike, then vanished back into the ordinary fabric of Wichita. As technology advanced, so did the investigation. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, DNA testing became possible. Evidence from earlier crime scenes was preserved, and scientists were able to extract genetic material. It wasn't enough to identify a suspect outright, but it provided a profile that could one day be matched. Detectives clung to this hope. Even if they couldn't catch BTK now, perhaps the science of the future would. By 1991, after the murder of Dolores Davis, the killings stopped. At least no new bodies surfaced. Some investigators believed he had moved away or died. Others suspected he was still in Wichita, lying low, satisfied with the legacy he had already built. The task force shrank over time. Resources pulled to more immediate cases. But BTK was never forgotten. He lingered in the background, a ghost story whispered among detectives. For more than a decade, there was silence. Then in 2004, everything changed. A newspaper article commemorating the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders stirred something inside Dennis Rader. He could not bear being forgotten, his legacy reduced to a cold case file, and so he returned. A package was found stuffed in a manila envelope at a local station. Inside were photographs of Vicky Vegala at the crime scene, pictures only the killer could have taken. Alongside them was a copy of her driver's license, stolen the day of her murder. It was proof. BTK was still alive. The city erupted in fear all over again. After more than a decade of quiet, their phantom was back. Detectives, some of whom had spent their entire careers chasing him, were thrust into the hunt once more. This time, however, they had better tools. DNA testing was far more advanced. Digital forensics had become a powerful weapon. And BTK, arrogant as ever, was beginning to make mistakes. He sent more packages, each one filled with puzzles, letters, and taunts. He reveled in the renewed attention, demanding recognition, feeding off the city's terror. But his obsession with control would prove his undoing. At one point, he asked police a bizarre question. Could a floppy disk be traced back to its source? Investigators, eager not to spook him, lied and said no. Trusting them, Rader sent in a purple floppy disk with his next message. Forensic experts examined the disk and found hidden metadata embedded in the files. There, in plain text, was the name Christ Lutheran Church and a user named Dennis. Investigators quickly cross-referenced this with church records and found their suspect, Dennis Rader, a 59-year-old compliance officer for the city of Park City. He was married, had children, and lived what appeared to be a completely ordinary suburban life. To his neighbors, he was strict but respectable. To his congregation, he was a leader. To his co-workers, he was meticulous, sometimes petty, but never alarming. When detectives placed him under surveillance, their suspicions only deepened. They collected DNA from a sample linked to his daughter and compared it with the genetic material preserved from BTK's crime scenes. The match was undeniable. After 31 years of investigation, the Phantom had a name. Dennis Rader was BTK. The arrest in February 2005 sent shockwaves through Wichita and the world. Reporters swarmed his quiet neighborhood. Neighbors stared in disbelief. The man they had trusted, the man who had lived among them as a family man and church president, was the same man who had terrorized their city for decades. For detectives, it was vindication, but also haunting. They had chased him for so long through so many dead ends, only to find that he had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. The investigation into BTK became a study in both patience and frustration. For decades, the police had played his game, followed his taunts, and endured his silences. They had built profiles, tested new technologies, and chased thousands of leads. In the end, it was not brute force or brilliant deduction that unmasked him, but his own arrogance. He had asked if a floppy disk could be traced. The answer was yes, and that single mistake toppled the mask he had worn for 3 decades. But even in custody, Dennis Rader reveled in his role as BTK. He gave long, chilling confessions, describing his crimes in detail that left families shattered all over again. Investigators realized that for him, the investigation had always been part of the thrill. The search, the headlines, the fear, it was all part of his performance. He had wanted to be remembered, and through the investigation that spanned 3 decades, he ensured that he would be. For nearly 3 decades, BTK wasn't just a killer. He was an unanswered question. Each crime left behind not only grief and terror, but also speculation. Wichita became a city of theories. In coffee shops, in break rooms, in quiet conversations behind closed doors, people tried to make sense of the senseless. Who was BTK? What drove him? And perhaps most unsettling of all, how had he managed to live among them without ever being caught? One of the earliest theories centered on the idea that BTK had military training. The Otero family murders, with their precision and control, didn't look like the work of someone impulsive. Investigators noticed the use of knots and bindings, the careful staging of the victims, and the lack of hesitation. These were hallmarks of discipline. The theory gained traction because Wichita had strong ties to McConnell Air Force Base and to the aircraft industry, both of which drew in men with technical and military backgrounds. Could BTK be a serviceman who learned how to dominate through training? The idea unsettled residents, many of whom had friends or family in uniform. Another theory suggested he was a law enforcement officer. The way BTK seemed to anticipate investigative steps, the way he avoided leaving behind obvious evidence. It felt almost as if he knew how police would respond. Detectives themselves debated this possibility. Was he one of their own? A man in uniform by day, a predator by night? If true, it explained why he seemed untouchable, always a step ahead. It also planted a dangerous seed of mistrust between citizens and the very officers sworn to protect them. Psychological theories were equally chilling. Some experts believed BTK was driven by a compulsion that blended control, sexuality, and sadism into one. They saw his letters as evidence of narcissism and obsession. He wasn't just killing, he was performing, creating a legacy. Others argued that his desire to communicate with the media pointed to insecurity. He needed validation, proof that his actions mattered. For these theorists, BTK was less a mastermind and more a fragile ego hiding behind the mask of a monster. But public speculation didn't stop at psychology or profession. Rumors spread that BTK wasn't one man at all, but a group. The killings had spanned decades, each with slight variations in method. Some people wondered if the crimes had been carried out by different individuals working under a shared name, a dark pact designed to terrorize Wichita. This theory fed on the city's desperation, because if BTK was many, then catching one would not stop the others. There were also whispers of a supernatural edge. For residents who couldn't reconcile how someone could evade capture for so long, it almost seemed easier to believe BTK had something unnatural about him. People described him as a shadow, a ghost who could slip through locked doors, strike without warning, and vanish into the night. These weren't rational theories, but they reflected the level of fear that had taken hold. When reality feels too impossible, people reach for myth. Within law enforcement, theories split between those who saw BTK as a man of structure and those who saw him as a man of chaos. The structured camp argued he was a meticulous planner, someone who studied his victims for weeks, mapped out their routines, and executed his crimes with military precision. The chaotic camp pointed to his mistakes, the survival of Kevin Bright, the sparing of children, the rambling letters full of contradictions. Perhaps he wasn't as controlled as he wanted people to think. Perhaps he was impulsive, lucky more than brilliant. The truth likely lived somewhere in between, but the debate shaped the way investigators pursued him. The public created its own folk theories. Some insisted they knew who he was: a strange neighbor, a reclusive co-worker, the man who lingered too long in the grocery store aisle. In neighborhoods across Wichita, suspicion grew like wildfire. Every odd behavior, every quiet man, every loner became a potential suspect. Families turned inward, curtains closed, conversations hushed. This paranoia was exactly what BTK wanted. In many ways, the theories themselves became part of his power. Then came the most disturbing speculation of all, the idea that BTK might be someone respected, someone woven into the fabric of the community. Not a drifter, not a shadow, but a man who attended church, coached Little League, or worked in city government. The thought was unbearable, yet it explained the unexplainable. How else could he live undetected for so long? This theory, as it turned out, was chillingly close to the truth. After Dennis Rader's arrest in 2005, many of these theories were revisited. He had in fact served in the Air Force. He had in fact studied criminology. He had in fact lived as a respected church leader and compliance officer. The speculation that once seemed paranoid or impossible suddenly felt prophetic. Wichita had been circling the truth for years without ever landing on it. Even with Rader behind bars, theories continued. Some questioned whether he had confessed to every crime. Could there be more victims hidden and forgotten, unlinked to his name? Others wondered if he had accomplices who had never been caught, though no evidence ever suggested this. And there were those who speculated on his psychology. Was he truly compelled by dark fantasies, or was it all about power and recognition? His own words, rambling and self-absorbed, left plenty of room for interpretation. Perhaps the most haunting theory was also the simplest, that BTK's ability to hide for so long said less about his brilliance and more about the limits of human perception. He wasn't invisible. He wasn't supernatural. He was just ordinary enough that no one looked twice. He was the man next door, the co-worker in the office, the father at the church picnic. The real terror wasn't that he was too clever to catch. It was that he was too ordinary to suspect. And in that ordinariness lay the most unsettling truth of all. Evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears a smile. Sometimes it mows the lawn. Sometimes it waves politely from across the street. And that realization, more than any official theory, is what continues to haunt the legacy of BTK. When Dennis Rader was finally unmasked in 2005, Wichita breathed a sigh of relief. The phantom that had haunted their city for 3 decades was no longer a shadow. He had a name, a face, a history. Behind bars, he could never hurt anyone again. But relief did not erase the unease. Because if BTK taught Wichita anything, it was that monsters don't always hide in dark alleys or wear ski masks. Sometimes they live next door. Sometimes they stand in the church pulpit. Sometimes they share the same quiet streets where children ride their bikes. The truth was never just about Rader. The truth was about the blindness of comfort, the fragility of safety, and the unsettling reality that evil often wears the mask of normalcy. For 31 years, he blended in seamlessly, mowing his lawn, attending church meetings, working as a city compliance officer. People shook his hand, shared small talk, trusted him. They never saw the predator behind the polite smile. And that is perhaps the most terrifying discovery of all, because if one man could live that double life for decades, how many others are out there, unnoticed? How many people walk through our neighborhoods every day carrying secrets we cannot imagine? Investigators often say that serial killers are rare, statistical anomalies. But statistics mean little to a community scarred by one. For Wichita, BTK was proof that the unimaginable can live quietly in plain sight. Even after his capture, unanswered questions remain. Did he confess to everything? Are there crimes he took to the grave? Victims who never had their names connected to his? Rader himself hinted at fantasies left unrealized, projects that never came to pass. If his arrogance hadn't betrayed him, how much longer could he have continued? Another year? Another decade? Would Wichita still be living under his shadow today? The cliffhanger of the BTK story is not simply that he was caught, but what his story reveals about us. We look at neighbors, co-workers, acquaintances, and we assume we know them. We assume that danger looks obvious, that predators are marked by menace. But Rader dismantled that illusion. He showed us that danger can look ordinary, that evil can thrive under the disguise of respectability, and that realization is something no court sentence can erase. When the people of Wichita locked their doors at night, some still glanced toward the darkness outside, remembering the years when their city lived in fear. For them, BTK will never fully vanish. He became more than a killer. He became a ghost story, a reminder that the worst monsters are often the ones who look most like us. And so, the question lingers, a question without a comfortable answer. If Dennis Rader could hide in plain sight for 3 decades, who else might be hiding right now? Who is the man across the street, the co-worker in the next cubicle, the stranger passing you on the sidewalk? Could another BTK be out there, waiting, watching, blending in, just as invisible as he once was? The end, the BTK story closes not with certainty, but with unease. Wichita may have found its phantom, but the world is filled with shadows. And in those shadows, the possibility remains. Somewhere, someone else could be writing their own dark story, preparing for the day when they too will step out of ordinary life and reveal the monster beneath. The question isn't whether BTK is gone. He is. The question is who might come next.